talk about growth. You know, if you're a poor country, economic growth is important. If you want to build more schools, if you want to build more clinics, if you want to build roads, the money has to come from somewhere. And if it isn't going to come from foreign aid, ideally, it should come from local resources. There's going to have to be growth in the economy, or better or different spending. I gave away the punchline for my talk in the headline that was in the program, I think, for what I'm going to say. And it's a quote from Herman Daly, who was an economist at the World Bank for many years, who said that when something grows, it gets bigger. When something develops, it gets different. I think, as David said, this idea that growth and development are synonymous is what's led us into a lot of the problems that we face today. They are not synonymous. When Robert McNamara became the president of the World Bank in 1968, he noticed that there was a lot of growth taking place in developing countries, but the poverty rates were not going down nearly as quickly as everybody had hoped and expected. And so he brought in the idea at the bank, and it was pretty widespread in the late 60s around the development community, of growth with equity. He said that growth and equity didn't have to be trade-offs, that you could get both if you paid attention to it and tried. But I think generally speaking, it didn't take long for us to lose the plot. It sounded like a good idea, but we moved on, or we moved back to simply focusing on growth. In the late 70s and through the 80s, we put a huge amount, we being the donor community, put a huge amount of effort on structural adjustment. There are many problems with structural adjustment, but structural adjustment its purpose was not to diminish poverty. Its purpose was growth. It was focused entirely on growth. The problem with structural adjustment, one of the problems, was that poverty got in the way. A lot of countries that were under structural adjustment programs suffered from pandemics, HIV/AIDS, natural disasters, conflict, and all kinds of other things, and structural adjustment basically didn't work. Nigeria, a country that I know fairly well, epitomizes, at least for me, the difference between growth and development. In 2014, Nigeria overhauled its national statistics for the first time since 1990, and the world discovered that Nigeria's GDP had grown to more than $500 billion, an 89% jump in a single year, making it the largest economy in Africa. But the truth is that apart from oil, cell phones, and some of the world's worst movies, almost every sector of Nigeria's productive economy is in a state of desperation, stagnation, or collapse. And a country that once exported food no longer feeds itself. Nigeria boasts 138 universities, up from 5 in 1970. That's about 3 new universities every year for 45 years. And yet 40% of the population remains illiterate. In 2004, 55% of all Nigerians lived in absolute poverty, earning less than $1 a day. By 2014, the number had risen to 61%, while the country boasted 16,000 millionaires and a Porsche showroom in Lagos. Chad provides a different kind of example. Chad has enjoyed very high levels of foreign direct investment since 2001, almost $2 billion a year in some years. It clocks an annual growth rate double or triple that of the United States. And it has a per capita income greater than half the countries in Africa. And yet Chad's life expectancy is low, adult literacy rates are terrible, and on the UN's Human Development Index for 2013, it ranked 184 out of 187 countries, 4th from the bottom. More than 60% of Chad's people live on less than $1.25 a day. The economy of Chad grew thanks to investments in oil, but life for the average citizen remains almost as bad as it was before the investment began. When I went to university, I've saved one of the books that I had in Economics 101. It's called How to Lie with Statistics. The book was already 10 years old when I was at university, and yet it's still in print. You can still get it. Not for $1.95. There's something in statistics there. But the reason I brought that up is because where development is concerned, we lie with statistics, and sometimes we just plain lie. The Economist, on June 13th, 2013, the Economist had an article, and I'm quoting from that article. The world has lately been making extraordinary progress in lifting people out of extreme poverty. Between 1990 and 2010, their number fell by half as a share of the total population in developing countries, a reduction of almost 1 billion people. Of the 7 billion people alive on the planet, 1.1 billion subsist below the internationally accepted extreme poverty line of $1.25 a day. That article was accompanied by a graph, and you saw the graph going from 2 billion people down to 1 billion, and the article was talking about where we hope to get to in 2030, and you saw the number going right down to zero. And there, on the graph, there were some little kiddies skipping along happily because everything is going so well. This mantra about how we've halved poverty in the last 20 or 30 years is commonplace now at the World Bank and UN agencies. The Canadian government does it. I don't know if you watch BBC World Service, but at least 2-3 times a day they run a little promo saying how well we've done in reducing poverty. We just have to try a little harder. The problem is that there is no contemporaneous data to back up this extravagant claim about going from 2 billion to 1 billion. The World Bank World Development Report stated in 2000, of the world's 6 billion people, 1.2 billion, a fifth, live on less than $1 a day, and these figures included China. In 1990, UNDP's Human Development Report said just over 1 billion people live in absolute poverty in the third world. These figures included China. In 1980, the bank's World Development Report said, and this is a quote, "The number of people living in absolute poverty in developing countries, excluding China and other centrally planned economies, is estimated to around 780 million. At the time, the estimate of the number of people living in absolute poverty in East Asia, including China, was just over 400 million. The total, therefore, in 1980 was a bit more than 1 billion people. Until the last year or so, nobody ever said that 2 billion people lived in absolute poverty. The number has been static at about 1 billion since 1980. The good news is that 1 billion represented 25% of the world's population in 1980, and it represents about 16% today. The bad news is in what these numbers hide. Absolute poverty has declined in China. So what this means is that it's increased elsewhere. Not only has there been no real progress in places where it matters so much, in some places like Nigeria, we're going backwards. Now this year we're going to conclude the Sustainable Development Goals, and everybody knows that the Sustainable Development Goals are very, very ambitious, much more ambitious than the Millennium Development Goals, and they're going to cost a lot of money. I think that the false claims about progress are a fig leaf for those who want business as usual and want to cover for the scramble for the alternatives to better and more development assistance. So we come to foreign direct investment and the private sector as the answer, because we're really not going to increase our foreign aid very much. So the private sector is being talked about more and more as the solution. Foreign direct investment can be a very important tool for development. Developing countries encourage foreign direct investment if it accomplishes at least one of, say, 3 things. It creates jobs, it creates spin-offs into the economy in other ways, or it pays taxes. The problem is with a lot of foreign direct investment, it doesn't go to the poorest countries. It's often chasing minerals and oil. It often doesn't create a lot of jobs. It often doesn't have a lot of spin-offs into the economy. And sometimes, as in the case of Chad, the taxes don't go to the right place anyway. Growth does not equal development. A rising tide does not float all boats. Some boats are on very short anchor chains. The idea that a rising tide will float all boats is the trickle-down theory. Most economists deny the trickle-down theory. They say we don't pay any attention to that anymore. But that's what growth is all about. The drive for growth is all about the trickle-down theory. John Kenneth Galbraith described the trickle-down theory once as being like feeding oats to a horse. If you feed the horse enough oats, some will fall through the road for the sparrows. And I don't think he was talking about oats falling out of the feed bag. Over the years, I worked a lot in Bangladesh, especially with the organization BRAC. We have an old friend here from Proshika. I know Proshika very well as well, but I wanted to talk about BRAC for a moment. BRAC is one of the best NGOs in my books and one of the biggest NGOs in the world. And if you don't know it, you should. I've written a book about it. It's a good book. BRAC learned the hard way about community development. It started off thinking about community development the way everybody did in the 1970s. You go into a community, you embrace everybody, bring them together and work on community development. It didn't work. What they began to realize was that in the typical average Bangladeshi village was that there were many communities. There was no single community. The better off people in the community had assets, they had land, they had money, they had connections. They knew how the system works. At the far end of the scale, the very poorest had none of that. No land, no connections, no education, very low self-esteem, not willing, not ready, not able to take chances that were brought in by outsiders. What BRAC learned is that if you want to do something about poverty in a Bangladeshi village, you have to target the poor. This isn't a very radical idea anymore, although some organizations still talk about community, meaning everybody. But what BRAC realized was that if you don't target the poor, a lot of the programs and the things that you're building will, let's not say be hijacked, they will just drift naturally away from the people that you're most concerned about. Development spending has to be targeted to where it will have the greatest impact on the greatest number of people. If a rising tide is going to float all boats, you have to pay attention to the smaller boats. You have to pay attention to the boats on smaller chains. You have to pay attention to the ones that are overloaded. Poverty is the greatest challenge of the 21st century. All of the world's great problems today have their roots in poverty, whether it's pollution, migration, unstable markets, unstable societies, very dangerous ideas, very dangerous movements. We can lie to ourselves about progress. We can lie to ourselves with statistics, but we're really only lying to our children and our grandchildren, and we will all pay the price. Thank you.